Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rent Collectors, Exploitation, Murder, and Redemption in Immigrant, L.A. by Jesse Katz, narrated by Jesse Katz. Part 1, 1980 to 2007. 1. A Forgotten Planet. When at last he opened his eyes, it was because he was falling. That meant he wasn't dead, not yet. The earth below Giovanni was like cinder, slick from an overnight mist and steep as a windswept dune. With each flinch of his body, the slope loosed beneath him, a hiss of shale, a rush of gravel, propelling him downward. A ribbon of lavender broke the darkness, revealing the day's first glimpse of La Rumorosa, the coil of borderland highway that writhes around the Sierra de Juarez, halfway between Tijuana and Mexicali. The gusts that moaned through the rusted canyons and granite crags have given La Rumorosa its name, the Whispering Woman. In the span of 14 miles, Carretera 2D twists more than 70 times, corkscrewing as it plunges 4,000 feet from shrouded mountaintop to swirling sands. La Rumorosa is a gash in the Baja Desert, a white-knuckle trek and a dumping ground. Mythologized in ghost stories and second-guessed by safety engineers, the passage stirs primordial awe. A forgotten planet, the Mexican poet Adolfo Sagastume calls La Rumorosa, a silent uterus. A city boy, Los Angeles-born, Giovanni had never heard of the place. Now it was swallowing him. Flailing his arms, pawing at dust, Giovanni felt the scrape of chaparral. He wrapped a hand around a gnarled root. It broke his slide. For a moment he was suspended, the cliff still once more. Blinking away the fog, Giovanni tried to make out the road above him, too high to see. Below, the gorge looked bottomless. He realized then that his shoes were gone, the black suede Jordans he'd bought with the check from his first honest job. Only socks covered his feet. He stared at his shirt, a white tee with the curly Sean John logo, now stained with vomit. Blood, too, had soiled the cotton. His neck throbbed so much he could barely turn his head. The skin burned. He thought maybe he'd been shot until he touched a finger to his throat. A collar of torn flesh, pulpy and raw, branded his windpipe. That was where the rope had seared him, where his killers, before tossing him over the edge, had cinched it tight, yanking like some soul-snatching repo men. Now he remembered. Giovanni rolled onto his elbows. His chest heaved. Tears stung his eyes. He tried to replay the previous night, to piece together the whole disastrous week. He was barely 18, but in just a few days of 2007, he'd lived a lifetime. From duress to euphoria to revulsion to catharsis and finally, betrayal. He'd been given a jale, a real heavy job, a test of his callousness and credulity. If he had the stomach for it, for dirtying himself in the name of an enterprise that flouted all checks on its power, he might at last earn the one thing he craved, respect. It was an easier word to say than love. If he backed out, he'd confirm every doubt and suspicion. Giovanni didn't stop to question why he'd been selected, what made him the right candidate for such a foul mission. The minute they'd put the .22 in his hand on a crowded L.A. sidewalk, he had no choice but to step up, to prove himself worthy. And then he'd gone and botched it. News crews were now doing live shots from that same stretch of blood-splattered pavement. Pastors were leading vigils. The Los Angeles Police Department's elite robbery homicide division was combing the neighborhood. The most nefarious prison mafia in America was demanding a scapegoat. The city was dangling a $75,000 reward for information leading to the capture of the suspect. A threat to everyone, the mayor declared. Everywhere. Hiding out in Mexico hadn't been Giovanni's idea, but he'd embraced the melodrama of a run for the border. He was a desperado blending into the jangle of Avenida Revolucion. losing himself in a TJ blur of clubs, strippers, booze. In a few months, the heat off him, his penance complete, Giovanni expected to make his return. Back to the girl from Subway with the irresistible dimples, whose name he'd inked that summer across his right hand. Back to his mom, a janitor at the mall, whose despondence he'd both fueled and fled. And back, if all went well, to his tribe of bald-headed soldiers and slangers, the outlaw capitalists of MacArthur Park, who offered an identity more consequential, more urgent than the routines of a neighborhood whose sweat kept the city scrubbed and fed and prosperous. "Don't die," he told himself. "Don't die like this." Giovanni had a baby face, even with a pencil's width of fuzz clinging to his upper lip. His grin began sly, but soon grew plentiful, and his eyebrows formed twin arches that seemed to scout for approval. Built like a flyweight, all clavicles and ribs, he'd been fidgety for as long as anyone could remember, a rat-a-tat of bouncing knees and rubbing hands. His first-grade teacher noted that Giovanni needs to learn to stay on task and work cooperatively. His third-grade teacher predicted that Giovanni could be outstanding if he were more serious and less distractible. His fifth-grade teacher found Giovanni so restless he seldom finishes an assignment. Giovanni's first great passion was Street Fighter, the arcade game, which he played at a mini-mall donut shop with quarters filched from his mom's change jar. He favored the role of Akuma, orange hair tied in a top knot, sculpted arms bursting from shredded sleeves, whose signature move resembles an act of frustration. Rearing back, the fighter slams his fist down to the earth, a godlike blow that unleashes a lethal shockwave. In middle school, Giovanni signed up for a different kind of martial experience, a National Guard youth contingent called the California Cadet Corps. He'd started 7th grade the week before 9/11, and with Americans rushing to enlist, he sensed a shared purpose in the program's starch and creases, a narrative that offered strength and stability. He learned to polish his shoes and center his garrison cap. He marched heel first in formation, pivoting to the column and flank commands, and saluted his major with a sharp karate chop to the brow. He wished he'd volunteered for the rifle drills to learn to port and present arms with one of those triggerless wooden parade models, but he'd been too nervous, afraid of an embarrassing bauble or a breach of some protocol he'd failed to consider. If he'd been asked then what he planned to do with his life, Giovanni wouldn't have hesitated. Join the army. He wanted to belong to something that mattered. Giovanni's dad, a sad-faced man from Guatemala, seesawed between sentimentality and affliction. Juan washed dishes and buffed floors and knocked down walls for a demolition crew. Despite 5 DUIs, he also valeted cars at a Hollywood club. He carried a picture of himself with Jean-Claude Van Damme from the time the action hero handed him the keys. Before his borracheras blew up the family, before Giovanni's mom reached for a kitchen knife to silence his rants, Juan had done what he could to guide Giovanni and channel his excitability. He gave his son a pit bull they called Rocky, and together they built a doghouse in their backyard. He strung a sand-filled punching bag from a tree out there, too, encouraging Giovanni to pummel it until his arms grew limp. To bulk him up on the cheap, Juan fed Giovanni 99-cent Whoppers, MacGyvering the burgers by slipping a fried egg between the buns. As the eldest of 3 kids, he had a brother a year younger and a sister born 6 years after that. Giovanni took the brunt of Juan's disappointments, reminding his jefito of his own interrupted dreams. In those moments of shame and frustration, Juan resorted to the old country discipline he'd been raised on in the mining province of Chiquimula. He'd dump uncooked rice on the kitchen floor and force Giovanni to kneel, bare-legged, until it felt like fire ants were burrowing into his skin. It was only by accident that Giovanni learned his dad was his stepdad. Not even the difference in their last names had tipped him off. His mom's last name didn't match his or Juan's. Giovanni assumed everyone could just choose their own. He was 13 when it happened. Rooting in a bedroom closet for Juan's trove of VHS porn, Giovanni stumbled on a family photo album. For the first time, he saw pictures of another man, a proud father showing off a newborn, and felt a pang of recognition. Mystery Dad looked like a swashbuckler, Ray-Bans, acid-wash jeans, 77 olds, and in his taut gaze Giovanni glimpsed a stolen past, a stunted future. The discovery confused and then enraged Giovanni, leaving him with the sense he'd ingested a toxin. What other lies had he been fed? His mom, Reina, begged him to understand. She had been so young, a runaway, pregnant at 17 and again at 18 with his brother. She had meant to tell him once he was old enough, but she'd never found the right time or words. It was a story she wanted to forget anyway, to bury along with the man in the picture. The explanation she offered her son, that his biological father had fallen ill when Giovanni was barely a year old, that the doctors had given him just months to live, that he had left her and the boys in L.A. so he could return to Mexico to die, was only partially true. With adolescence came the freedom of skating, a license to turn obstacles into exploits. Giovanni pored over the California Cheap Skates catalog, a universe of coastal cool regalia that promised style and status, even if Reina's paycheck couldn't possibly stretch that far. His first board, a Dark Star, came to him hot. A dude rolled by in a van, asked Giovanni if he liked to skate, and fobbed it off on him for $20. What Giovanni coveted most were Chad Muska shoes. The San Diego freestyler had a scraggy, fearless aesthetic, blonde mane flopping as he nose-slid down handrails, cradling a boombox. The sneakers featured a Velcro compartment, a stash built into the tongue. By the time his mom scraped together the cash to award him a pair, Giovanni had caught on to the design. He ollied through the hood in peg-leg jeans, hair gelled and spiked, chili peppers and Metallica on his headphones, and yerba squirreled away under his laces. Smoking weed made Giovanni's heart race and his throat tighten. He was 14 the first time he panicked. His mom took him to Children's Hospital in East Hollywood, but the EKGs and X-rays showed nothing. 3 weeks later, he was back in the ER complaining of dizziness and chest pain, and then 4 more times over the next 2 months. His mom feared something catastrophic. The doctors diagnosed anxiety and depression, instructing Giovanni to take deep, slow breaths and think of pleasant thoughts. As a child, Reina had been cast north by El Salvador's civil war and secreted across the border in the trunk of a sedan. It was an uprooting she never quite recovered from, a tale of movement and survival that instead of offering hope, left her feeling out of step. She wore her hair in bangs and applied her eyeliner in feline swoops. She'd worked as a housekeeper and a hotel maid and a server at a late-night pretzel stand. Her Spanish was snappy and insistent, but when she switched to English, her voice grew softer and warier, as if every word were a question. Unlike most of the men in her life, Reina was not a drinker. She preferred McDonald's coffee, cut with 4 sugars and 4 creamers. There were sorrows she didn't know how to drown. One morning in 2004, not long after Giovanni started high school, he poked his head into his mom's bedroom. In his younger years, he'd creep and then pounce, waking Reina with a belly flop. She'd muss his hair and call him Mono, her little monkey. This time he found her under the covers, trembling, a bundle of whimpers and wails. "What the?" he blurted. Then he saw the mess of pills. He knew he hadn't done much to make her life easier, but Giovanni couldn't imagine that his own mom would no longer have it in her to raise her children, to muster worries, to dispense reprimands. He dialed 911. The operator told him to keep her awake until paramedics arrived. Giovanni shook his mom. He begged her to open her eyes, demanded she not leave him. Reina arrived at Good Samaritan sobbing. She confessed that she'd been popping ibuprofens for the past day and a half, an overdose of Motrin, maybe 65 in all. "I don't want to be in this world anymore," she told the doctors. On her chart, they wrote, "family problems." Giovanni would always remember how he felt at that moment, as if the earth were spinning too fast to hold him in place. He had saved his mom. He was losing his way. It was Giovanni's 15th birthday. As the sun inched higher, rousing the lizards from their blanched hideouts and stirring the quail that grubbed seeds in La Rumorosa's brush, Giovanni saw that he was alone. Nobody was watching to make sure he died. Nobody was around to offer help. If he couldn't scratch his way up, nobody would ever spot him hugging the cliff, not until it was too late. Giovanni dug his feet into the sediment. He lunged and clawed. His neck screamed. The cliff held. Giovanni did it again, squirming faster, reaching higher. He'd been disposed of, and now he'd awoken. Carretera Federal 2D was just above him. He didn't know where he was going or how to get there or what he would do if he made it. He just knew he had to pull himself out to rise from this woeful tomb. 2. The Shadows of Life. Giovanni Macedo, the son of Roberto Macedo and Reina Flores, was conceived in 1988 in a studio apartment on the top floor of a 4-story brick building in MacArthur Park. When it opened on Union Avenue in the 1920s, the Hotel Strand advertised the finest furnished rooms in a luxurious social hall, where the Pastel Concert Trio performed operatic selections and the California Veterans Political Club held its weekly luncheons. Half a century later, it was a flophouse in the most turbulent quarter of Los Angeles. Rooms went for $10 a day, $60 a week. So much of the neighborhood was like that: faded glamour, precarious dreams, repurposed space. MacArthur Park revolved around a 32-acre village green that sloped inward like an amphitheater before spilling into a turbid, mushroom-shaped lagoon, a body of water that shimmered from afar and closer simmered with foamy debris. Known as Westlake since the 19th century and rechristened MacArthur Park during World War II, the park became a synonym for the community that grew around it. The name referred to both. The geography of one shaped the culture of the other. Just 4 blocks from the place of Giovanni's creation, the park grounds sustained an urban wonderland of flora and fauna, 42 varieties of trees, from black walnut and wild plum to Australian tea and African sausage, plus 9 species of birds and at least 5 kinds of fish, alongside a carnival of squatters and grifters and junkies. MacArthur Park in the 1980s was the seedbed of LA's crack epidemic, a marriage of pain and profit. Something like 1,000 smokers and suppliers congregated there every day, their deals and tricks befouling the ryegrass. Yet even then, the grand old park managed to accommodate soccer tourneys and soup kitchens, union rallies, and master-level chess matches. Evangelists bellowed into battery-powered megaphones about El Infierno. Gamblers rolled dice on the concrete pathways. Photographers lugging accordion lens Polaroids created instant souvenirs at the lake's rim, and anglers, they called themselves ghetto carpers, probed the murky depths for fish that could top 30 pounds. 4 street gangs vied for a cut of MacArthur Park's commerce, including 2 that would swell into international federations: Marta Salvatrucha, the park's west side, and 18th Street, the park's east side. So many squad cars plowed across the grass in those days, gardeners were forever repairing crushed sprinkler heads. To deter crime and improve sightlines, the city yanked out benches, chopped down bushes. It even removed the barbecue grills to discourage the down and out from dining on the lake's waterfowl. The city had engineered the park 100 years earlier, flooding an alkaline swamp with millions of gallons from the municipal water supply. Westlake instantly became one of LA's most fashionable destinations, an open-air resort scarcely a mile from the hubbub of downtown. Elegant hotels and smart boutiques ringed the park, its waters the embodiment of nature's face, as 'twere some open book that God had writ, as the poet and philanthropist Eliza Otis put it. She was married to General Harrison Gray Otis, the Los Angeles Times founder, and at the dawn of the 20th century they lived on a prime corner of the park in a mansion called the Bivouac. The lake beckoned in postcards. It hosted floating trees at Christmas time and mock warship battles during the 4th of July, light shows, log rolling contests, pet seals, and generations of rowboats, canoes, and gondolas. Charlie Chaplin filmed at the water's edge. In 1907, a manacled Harry Houdini plunged into the lake from the roof of a boathouse. Even then, in that golden age, the lake proved a mirage, a stage for the aggrieved and dejected. By the time Houdini defied death there, at least 9 people had chosen the waters for their final exit, causing one long-gone newspaper to lament that Westlake will soon become a reminder of the shadows of life instead of a diversion. The unfortunate included a pastor's wife suffering from melancholia, an insurance man burdened by gambling debts, a hotel chambermaid spurned by her philandering husband, the water-fearing sister of the British vice-consul, and a bartender at a German saloon who had fastened a rock to a shoestring and roped it around his neck. More attempted to drown themselves only to be rescued, and more threatened it only to be exposed as hoaxers. For a time, whenever anyone went missing in Los Angeles, the first impulse was to check the lake. A city high on land speculation eventually outgrew Westlake. Encapsulated in cars and propelled by freeways, Angelenos sought out more room, greater privacy. It was a pattern that would repeat and accelerate. The affluent gravitated west toward the ocean or north up into the canyons and foothills. The middle class branched out to the valleys and then the desert, distancing themselves from whatever they deemed worn and unruly. As the hotels sagged and their neon dimmed, MacArthur Park began to fray. It became a pensioner's haunt, a panhandler's haven. Still, the lake exerted a strange allure. There were reckless boaters and overconfident swimmers, and rescuers who became mired in the muck. A sailor's wife, an Englishman with an umbrella, Max the pinochle player. In 1951, police detained a man in the park on a morals charge, code for the official entrapment of cruisers. He broke loose and flung himself in the lake, preferring to die in the water than face public scorn. MacArthur Park evolved into a bohemian refuge, a counterculture lab. The songwriter Jimmy Webb used to meet his lover, an office worker at the adjacent American Cement building, for lakefront picnics. When the romance ended, he channeled his longing into a celebrated and maligned anthem about a cake out in the rain, recorded by everyone from Richard Harris and Waylon Jennings to the Four Tops and Donna Summer, that immortalized MacArthur Park in the pop canon. When engineers drained the lake in the 1970s to install an aeration system and pave its 14-foot deep floor, a retired aerospace worker went foraging in the sludge. He assembled his finds into Baroque sculptures, folk art monuments that featured brass knuckles, false teeth, rusty bullets, and more than 100 guns. By the 1980s, MacArthur Park had become an immigrant crossroads, America's new Ellis Island. Tens of thousands of Salvadorans and Guatemalans, displaced by oppressive U.S.-backed regimes and their paramilitary forces, poured into the neighborhood. Thousands more Mexicans fleeing economic collapse and Cubans thrust onto hasty boat lifts added to MacArthur Park's transformation. They found a toehold in the shabby tenements, freedom in the trodden parkland. Largely ignored by a suburbanizing city, the newcomers rummaged and salvaged, remaking MacArthur Park in their own image. The Westlake Theater, a Churrigueresque movie palace, became an indoor swap meet. California Bank was reborn El Piojito, a discount store, and Miss Clay's, an importer of chinoiserie, would become Pollo Campero, the Central American fried chicken king. The sudden concentration of so many dreamers, refugees and exiles, former soldiers and one-time insurgents, wanderers, castaways, pilgrims, Spanish speakers, Quiche speakers, Zapotec speakers, and other indigenous peoples escaping pogroms across the Americas, made MacArthur Park feel both futuristic and primal. No other place in Los Angeles thrummed with its subversive energy or labored under the weight of so much trauma. It was the kaleidoscope that rendered every superficial trope about the city unrecognizable, the crystal ball that anticipated the fractures that would jag through every facet of American life: politics, immigration, housing, crime, education, the economics of staying afloat. MacArthur Park became the epicenter of the fake ID trade. It birthed the worst police scandal in LA history. Its fire station was the busiest in the country. With some 100,000 people squeezed into roughly 2.5 square miles, many of them sleeping head to toe in the warren of rooming houses that had fallen into the hands of the city's most notorious slumlords, the neighborhood at its densest was nearly 50 times more crowded than the rest of LA. It was more tightly packed even than Manhattan. MacArthur Park helped cement Los Angeles's renown as the nation's undocumented immigrant capital. It was the most visible expression of a megalopolis that was home to 1 million of the country's 11 million people without papers, and to another 750,000 U.S. citizen or legal resident Angelenos living with an undocumented family member. To speak of an immigration system as if there were a legal option for the vast majority of foreign-born people desperate to enter the country was to deny reality. LA was proof that the border, no matter how militarized and menacing, could be beat. Immigration agents caught 1 million-plus crossers every year. Hundreds more succumbed to heat or drowning or suffocation. Still, that could not stem a diaspora hastened by the U.S. government's geopolitical meddling and the American people's appetite for cheap and tenacious labor. And then once those who had risked everything to cross were already here, that same government, our same nation of employers and consumers, couldn't agree on what to do with them. It was a cold bargain. Toil at the margins, stay out of trouble, swallow your humiliations, forego the ability to vote or serve on a jury or collect unemployment or ever feel secure in your skin. And if you're lucky, America might just leave you in limbo. 10 years, 20, a generation. MacArthur Park strained under the exigencies of that shadow population, a virtually permanent subclass left to invent its own opportunities, to improvise its own survival. Raina's path to MacArthur Park began when she was 9 in 1980 and living in a cinder block and rebar shanty that doubled as a dressmaking shop in San Salvador's Barrio Santa Anita. 3 generations of her family, including the doting matriarch Mama Nellie, rented 2 dirt floor rooms in the back. The seamstress lived in the front with her 3 children. Raina didn't yet grasp that Mama Nellie was not her mother but her grandmother, or that her 4 older cousins all seemed to be lacking mothers too. The poverty and persecution that were beginning to jolt El Salvador in the 1970s were also fracturing her family. Both of Raina's aunts and then her mother had already stolen away from the house on 15 Avenida Sur, embarking on dangerous, degrading journeys north. By leaving their children behind, the women volunteered to shoulder all the risks of the crossing, to establish themselves first in the U.S. and then send for their kids. It was a familiar gambit, repeated by many thousands of Central American parents, the least bad option for a people whose countries had been commandeered as Cold War battlefields. It's a mistake, and it's a necessity, says Raina's Tia Dina, her mom's older sister, who left 2 children with Mama Nellie. Even when the initial risk paid off, when parents later procured visas and plane tickets to reunite with their daughters and sons, the years apart were often hard to recover, the trust slow to mend. And it's a stroke of luck, says Tia Dina, when a child arrives and can comprehend it. Raina's mom made her way north in 1973. As the youngest of 3 siblings, she'd lived the longest under the heavy hand of the man in Mama Nellie's life, an algebra teacher with a volcanic temper. When he drank, he was another man, very, very offensive, Tia Dina says, and he'd tell us we were nothing. He'd say, "And you, what are you going to do with your life? Become a prostitute?" I'd tell my mom, "Look, I'm not going to let this old man insult me. And she'd say, "You know what, mija? You have to learn to shut your mouth."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?